Test.
Good afternoon. This is a very polite group. Welcome to a beautiful fall day in Exeter, New Hampshire. The sun is shining, the leaves are turning red and orange and gold. And on behalf of Seacoast Media Group and the USA Today Network, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our New Hampshire Presidential Town Hall with Vice President Mike Pence. I'm Howard Altschuler, Executive Editor of Seacoast Media Group, and in New Hampshire we publish the Exeter Newsletter, the local paper in this town, as well as the Portsmouth Herald, Foster's Daily Democrat, Hampton Union, the website Seacoast Online, and Fosters.com. New Hampshire town halls, presidential town halls, and this site in particular are steeped in history. On this very spot, in 1860, in March, Abraham Lincoln, the first Republican president, gave an address. A few months later, he launched his presidential bid, and the rest is history. The town of Exeter itself makes a good claim to being the birthplace of the Republican Party. Amos Tuck, an Exeter resident, served in Congress with Lincoln. They became good friends. And a group of political leaders didn't want to see slavery expand to the new states in the country, and they got together 170 years ago this month in Exeter and began the hard work of creating a new political party. The Exeter primary itself celebrated its 100th anniversary in 2020. In 1920, the first presidential primary grew out of a reform movement in the country that led to massive changes like women getting the right to vote, direct election of US senators, and prohibition too, which some people might think was not a particularly good advancement. The New Hampshire primary has been successful and working for 100 plus years because it really connects voters and candidates. There's nothing more real than a television ad, more real than social media, more real than what passes for debates today on television, than an honest conversation between a voter and a candidate who's truly listening and understands. We ask that, so tonight this afternoon, you're going to get a chance to ask questions. Please ask the questions that are close to your heart, that you truly care about, and I'm sure the Vice President will answer them. We ask that tonight's conversation be civil and substantive, and let's show everyone democracy done right. On your seat, you'll find a survey card. Please fill it out to let us know what issues are most important to you. Your answers will guide our election coverage going forward. Please remember to shut off your cell phone, and that's a reminder to myself as well. And now, to introduce this afternoon's special guest and to moderate today's conversation, let me introduce you to my colleague, USA Today White House correspondent, Maureen Grappi.
Thanks, Howard. Thanks to all of you for being here, and thanks to those who are watching us remotely. So here's the format for the next hour. Vice President Pence will give some brief opening remarks, and then I'll kick off the conversation with the first question, and then it will be your turn. That's why we're here today, to hear from all of you, to hear what's on your mind. So if you have a question for the Vice President, please raise your hand. If he calls on you, please wait till we can get a microphone over to you before asking the question. Please stand and tell us your name and where you're from. So a little bit about our speaker today. Vice President Pence, of course, served in the last administration. Before that, he was Indiana's governor for 4 years, and he served in Congress for 12 years. That's when I first started covering him. I was a reporter for the Indianapolis Star when he was first elected in 2000. And one of the first stories I wrote about him was how he created a mini radio studio in his congressional office when he was first elected, because before he was a member of Congress, he was a radio talk show host in Indiana, and he described his show as Rush Limbaugh on decaf. So one final fun fact about him before we bring him out. Howard mentioned the connection in this town hall to Abraham Lincoln. Vice President Pence was a history major in college, and he did his senior thesis on the religious expression of Abraham Lincoln. So if any of you are interested in that, you can ask him about it, and we'll see how well he remembers his senior thesis. So with that, please welcome Vice President Pence. Thank you, sir. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Maureen. Thank you all very much for coming out. And how about a big round of applause for USA Today and the Seacoast Media Group. I'm just delighted to be with you all, and I appreciate you making time on a beautiful afternoon here in Exeter to come and have a conversation about the future of this country. I'm going to make some very brief remarks, maybe 45 minutes. Now, let me just share with you a few things from my heart. You know, I'm running for president because I think this country's in a lot of trouble. I think President Joe Biden has weakened America at home and abroad. And now is the time, I believe, for our nation to produce leadership committed to the agenda that's always made America strong and prosperous and free. I also think it's no time for on-the-job training. As Maureen said, we've known each other a long time. She met me when I was a member of Congress. I was actually a leader in the Congress of the United States. I went on to be governor of the state of Indiana, and I was your vice president for 4 years. I represented our country around the world, and with the unfolding events that we see happening in Israel and in Eastern Europe, and with the struggles in this economy that families are facing, where we've seen the worst inflation in the last 40 years, over the last 2.5 years, a crisis at our border of unimaginable proportions, the flow of humanity as well as fentanyl and that's claiming lives in communities here in New Hampshire and all across the country, a war on energy by this administration that literally has caused the cost of living and cost of gasoline go through the roof. Now more than ever, we need leadership in Washington, D.C. that knows how to turn things around. I also believe it's a time for us to restore a threshold of civility in public life. You know, people who know me well know I'm a conservative, but I'm not in a bad mood about it. You know, I've always believed that you can disagree with people vigorously without questioning their sincerity or their intentions. And I really do believe, and I hope it's been emblematic of my career, that I've tried to live that out as a leader in Congress and as a governor and as a vice president. And when I think of the magnitude of challenges facing our country today, I think we need leadership that can appeal to the better angels of our nature, as Abraham Lincoln famously said. I make no other comparison to Abraham Lincoln other than this. He grew up in Indiana. A lot of people don't know that. Born in Kentucky, but they moved to Indiana, to a little place that we commemorate down there. When he was about 5 years old, he would leave Indiana in his early 20s, but Lincoln famously said, "There I grew up." And I have to think sometimes that the character and the values the nation witnessed that day were forged in those woods in southern Indiana. One of my predecessors as governor of Indiana said famously, "Lincoln made Illinois, but Indiana made Lincoln." And I really do believe that now more than ever we ought to be reflecting on the character of leadership that he represented. A deep commitment to the Constitution of the United States, a boundless belief in the vision of our founders. And we ought to have the same optimism that he had and that my other heroes have, like Ronald Reagan, who believed that whatever challenges that we were facing, that there's nothing the American people can't overcome if we just have government as good as our people. So that's why I'm running. Karen and I stepped forward. I'm not running for president because I want to know what it's like to work at the White House. Already figured that one out. I'm running for president because I truly do believe, and I say this with all humility, that I'm the most qualified, the most experienced, the most tested conservative seeking the Republican nomination for president of the United States. And as such, Karen and I reflected as we prayed through this decision about those ancient words that to whom much is given, much will be required. So we've stepped forward. Been spending a fair amount of time in New Hampshire, a fair amount of time in Iowa. Grateful to have a chance to chat with you all today. And I promise you from the bottom of my heart, you give me this opportunity not just to lead the Republican Party to victory in 2024, but to lead this nation as President of the United States. I promise you that we will bring this nation back stronger and more prosperous than ever before. So help me God. Thank you for coming. And Maureen gets the first question.
I get the first question. So when you were here in New Hampshire last month, you gave a speech on populism.
I did.
You warned that populism would lead to a road to ruin for the Republican Party. So can you tell us what's wrong with populism and why isn't that a pure form of democracy?
Well, first off, thank you for the question. I gave a talk at St. Anselm College about a choice I think that Republican voters are facing, and everyone who will vote in the Republican primary here in the Granite State will face. Look, I started in politics as a Democrat. My heroes of my youth were Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and John F. Kennedy. When I heard the voice of Ronald Reagan, I heard the values that he represented, I joined the Republican Party and never looked back. But the principles that Reagan brought to the Republican Party were not original to him. They were really grounded in the timeless ideals of the American public, I believe, which is a commitment to a strong national defense, American leadership in the world, a commitment to limited government and fiscal responsibility, a commitment to traditional values and the right to life. Those are the ideas that drew me to the Republican Party, and I've been about those ever since. I'm grateful that Maureen mentioned that I was a talk radio show host. A lot of people don't know that. But in my years in Congress and as governor and as vice president, we hewed to those principles every single day, all the way through the Trump-Pence years. That was the agenda we governed on. But I think what Republican voters deserve to know today is that my former running mate is not running on the agenda that we governed on. And several of his imitators in this primary are not either. I mean, where we stood for a strong national defense for American leadership in the world, I hear Donald Trump and others in this race, they're shying away from American leadership in the world. As Russia continues its unconscionable invasion in Ukraine, They argue that we have no national interest there in repelling Russian aggression. I believe America's the leader of the free world, and the Republican Party has always stood for that principle. But then on other issues where we cut taxes more than any other administration in history, but Donald Trump's actually advocating the largest tax increase in history, a tariff on goods coming into the United States of 10%, which would raise the cost of living and the cost at retail, virtually everything we buy, significantly, and cost hundreds of thousands of jobs. And then on the values most precious to me, the sanctity of life, I see my former running mate and others shying away and even criticizing pro-life laws passed in states around the country. So to me, that's the dividing line, if I can, Maureen, that I want people to know that I'm committed to that timeless conservative agenda that's defined our movement for the last 40 years, and I believe finds its roots all the way back in the founding of the Republican Party. But others give voice to a populism unmoored to conservative principles. And ultimately, I think ideas have consequences, and that it's going to be about not just electing a person, but electing an agenda that'll turn this country around, and I know ours will. Next question, you slip your hand in the air. I'd love to hear your first name, and they want me to wait until you get your microphone, but I'll get to as many as I can. Yes, tell me your name.
Karishma, I'm from Exeter, New Hampshire.
Oh, very good to meet you, thank you.
The United States Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick died from injuries sustained during the Capitol attack on January 6, 2021. 4 more officers died by suicide within the next 7 months. I respectfully request a moment of silence to remember Officer Brian Sicknick, Officer Gunther Hashida, Officer Kyle DeFreitag, Officer Howard Liebengood, and Officer Jeffrey Smith. Thank you. We should not forget that the deaths of these officers and the injuries sustained by 138 men and women serving to protect our democracy was a direct result of the lies told repeatedly by the current GOP frontrunner, Donald Trump. We are proud Granite Staters. We believe in democracy, truth, and justice. We want the candidate that we support to stand up for the brave officers who were injured or died as a direct result of Donald Trump's abhorrent and unpatriotic lies. We do not want the officers' ultimate sacrifice to be forgotten. Vice President Pence, please share your thoughts.
Well, thank you for caring so much about men and women of law enforcement. January 6th was a tragic day. I was there. But it was thanks to the courageous efforts of hundreds of law enforcement officers that the riot was quelled, and we were able to reconvene the Congress the very same day. And I'll always believe, by God's grace, I did my duty that day to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. And it's among the reasons why I'm running. I mean, when you stand on that inaugural platform, I put my left hand on Ronald Reagan's Bible. I raised my right hand. I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. It's the promise we make to the American people, and it ends with a prayer. So help me God. And despite the fact that the former president had been convinced by a group of crackpot lawyers that I had some authority to overturn the election, I'd made it clear to him that I did not. And I knew what my duty was that day. And I want people to know that I really do believe the way forward in our country is for us to get back to what we all agree on. The ideals enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, the government enshrined and the principles enshrined in the Constitution and its Bill of Rights. And I hope we proved in part that day that I'm that man. The Bible says he keeps his oath even when it hurts. I know something about that. I was on the ballot. But for me, it was very clear. States conduct elections. States certify presidential elections and then send electors through the Electoral College to the Congress. And the only role of the Congress under Article 2 is to open and count the electoral votes. They can hear objections. Congress can consider those objections. But my duty, I knew, was to preside over a joint session of Congress that would open and count the votes. And as I said, by God's grace, we did it that day. And I'll never forget the heroic men and women in uniform that made it possible for us to turn a day of tragedy into a triumph of freedom. God bless them all. Yes, sir. Hi. They got a mic coming for you.
Hi, my name is Luke Miller. I'm from Westport, Connecticut.
Hi, Luke.
So I understand you've long been a proponent of tax cuts, and while you support a constitutional amendment that would limit federal spending to a percentage of GDP, it just seems to me that it's very difficult to amend the Constitution. It doesn't seem like that would be something that could realistically be achieved. So I guess given that, my question is, how are you going to ensure that your tax cuts do not exacerbate the kind of deficit crisis we've been experiencing and cause us to surpass the debt ceiling and damage U.S. credit abroad?
Yeah, really smart question. Did you say you're a candidate for something? Yeah. I like him. That's a great question. It's one that bears upon your generation particularly. I think I was the first person in this race that was talking about the national debt. We have a national debt today the size of our nation's economy for the first time since the end of World War II. That's what you know. What you don't know is unless we're willing to produce leadership that will reform the entitlements that are 75% of our federal spending, that national debt's going to increase by 5 times in the next 20 years. I mean, if you think inflation is bad today with $33 trillion in debt, try $150 trillion. It's coming. And the way we can do it is we've got to be straight with your generation. Number one, you're never going to balance the federal budget again unless you get the economy moving again. That's why if I'm president of the United States, we're going to make those Trump-Pence tax cuts permanent. We are. They actually produced more revenue in the 3 years that followed them and since. So you can cut taxes in a way that will create more investment and more growth. And we saw wages rise, 7 million new jobs. So that's first. But there's no substitute for fiscal responsibility, which is your point. And I believe we've got to produce leadership that when I come in, the first thing I'll do is freeze all non-defense spending in the federal budget. But then I'm going to go to the American people in forums just like this, if I'm your president. And we're going to talk about reforming these programs that really threaten this next generation's future. Now, it has to do with Social Security and Medicare, which will become a political issue as it always does, right? So here's how I would handle it. Number one, I'd say to everybody that's got hair the same color as me, this does not affect you, right? If you're in retirement today or near retirement, we're not going to make any changes to the program. We're going to keep the deal. In fact, we're going to reform it so the automatic cuts that are set for 8 years from now in Social Security don't happen. Do you know if we don't reform Social Security today, the average couple will face a $17,000 cut in Social Security benefits in 8 years, mandatory cuts. Okay, tough stuff, but it's true. Number one, we say to people who are seniors, no change. Then we say to people who are maybe 40 years old or older, no change for you either. I don't believe in changing horses in the middle of the stream. You've been paying into the deal for half of your career, we'll keep it. But for Americans under the age of 40, and I see more than a few here, I'd like to have a conversation. I'd like to see if we could take this New Deal program of Social Security and offer you a better deal. Here's how it works. Number one, in exchange for you being willing to let us maybe raise the age of retirement or put in means testing or other changes that'll save us from that cliff, that fiscal cliff that we're facing, what I'd like to do is give you the opportunity to invest a portion of your payroll taxes in a personal savings account. I mean, what we pay out right now on Social Security is about 1% over the course of your lifetime. If we let you put a portion of your payroll taxes in a personal savings account and it generates 2% in a mutual fund, that's twice what Social Security is going to give you. And it's your money, right? So to me, that's an idea whose time has come, is literally allowing younger Americans to embrace something that we all would understand is called an annuity type program. Now, you can't touch the money until you're retired. That's okay, but it'll be there for you because it's your money. That's how you take a New Deal program and make it a better deal. And that's also how you head off this massive fiscal crisis that we're going to be facing if we don't tackle the national debt. Great question. Yes, sir, in the back. Hi.
My name is Matthew Murray, and I'm from Sherman, Connecticut.
Hi, Matthew.
Hi, how are you? So I, too, registered as a Republican based upon Ronald Reagan, and he was my first vote, and he had 4 big principles, one of which was reducing government spending. For the last 3 years, this government has run deficits of over $1 trillion.
Yeah.
So you speak about U.S. leadership, but U.S. leadership also requires money, spending our money on overseas causes. Can you tell us, if you're elected president, what is the test for when we spend another $77 billion in Ukraine, or whether we spend $10 billion in Israel? They're important causes, don't get me wrong. But what's the balance between how much further we grow the federal deficit versus how much further we spend our tax dollars on other people's wars?
It's a very fair question, and thanks for respectfully asking it. No, these are issues that generate real passion. Short answer is national interest. We look, I've been to Ukraine. I've stood at what was the gravesite of a mass grave behind a church in a small town called Bucha. What Russia has done there is war crimes and inhumane. There would be enough of a moral reason to be involved there, but we have a moral reason to be involved many places. The reason I believe the United States of America should support the military in Ukraine until they defeat and repel the Russian invasion, because I think it's in our national interest to do it. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I met Vladimir Putin. I've studied his writings as well. I have no doubt in my mind that if he overruns Ukraine, it's not going to be long before he crosses a border of a NATO country that we're going to be required to send our troops to fight. Ronald Reagan articulated something called the Reagan Doctrine back in 1985. He said, look, here's the deal. If you're willing to fight the communists in your country with your soldiers, we'll give you the means to fight them there so we don't ever have to fight them. It's part of what brought down the Soviet Union. Was because we were able to support efforts around the world that literally drained. I mean, Russia today has gone from the second most powerful military in the world to the second most powerful military in Ukraine in just a year and a half, with an investment of 5% of our defense budget. So I think it's in our national interest to ensure that someday we're not fighting Russia, that we give the soldiers in Ukraine what they need to fight them. And I'll continue to stand on that. But it's national interest. It's a really good question on your part. With regard to Israel, I consider Israel our most cherished ally. And if the world knows nothing else, the world should know this. In the wake of the horrific events of this past weekend, America stands with Israel. And that we should continue to stand firm. We should have assets in the region. We should give them what they need to make this fight. They can make this fight. Because today, Israel has to not just contain Hamas, they have to destroy Hamas. But having assets in the region to make it clear to Hezbollah in Lebanon, to Iran, and the other powers in the region that everybody needs to stand down, that we're going to defend Israel if she needs defending. I believe it's absolutely in our nation's interest. I really do. I'm going to put him down as a maybe. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is CJ. I'm a junior at the boarding school Phillips Exeter from Orange County, California. I think under this administration, we've become softer on our enemies, but also on our allies. And I think it's frustrating to see the United States enter multilateral partnerships, including in NATO and the UN, where we support countries economically and militarily, and they don't give back or they even go with our enemies, like Germany building Nord Stream 2 with Russia. So I wanted to ask, will you commit to making NATO members pay 2% of their GDP to military causes and repay the United States for all of the support we've given them?
Smart guy. I like this guy. Run for something someday, will you? Well, that was what I said when I gave the first speech by our administration in Europe a few months after we were elected in 2016. Yes. Short answer, yes. Yeah, our NATO allies had committed to spend 2% of their GDP on our common defense. They weren't doing that. I will tell you, I'm proud of the fact that by making that demand, before we left office, our NATO allies were investing $120 billion more in our common defense. Frankly, it's made it possible for our NATO allies to be in a better position, to be prepared to support the resistance in Ukraine against the Russian invasion. So you're absolutely right. It's called a common defense. We had the same message to South Korea. We ought to be calling on our allies to do their part, and I think it's absolutely essential. But make no mistake about it, we're the leader of the free world. And I remember one time I was sitting with the head of one of our European countries, and he was complaining about us making demands about more funding. And I wrote about it in my book, which you ought to read. But I looked across the table at the Prime Minister and I said, I hear what you're saying. I hear you don't like us telling you that you need to pay your fair share. But I said, that's what we call being leader of the free world. Tell the free world, step up, do your part. We're doing our part. You need to do yours. You're absolutely right. And the world will be more peaceful as a result. Now let's see, how about second row right here? Yes, sir. Microphone's coming. Hi.
Well, I live in Massachusetts.
Hey, Tom.
And I come up here because we get retail politics, which you don't find in other places other than maybe Iowa.
Yeah.
So I guess I'll go to Social Security, and because I get it. The reason why the Social Security Fund is bankrupt today is because the money from that fund has been borrowed by the government since about the time of Ronald Reagan.
Right.
So if we were to replace that money rather than decrease other people's benefits later on in life, wouldn't that make it solvent for, say, another 40 or more years?
Tom, it's not a bad thought. In fact, back when we were talking, when I was in the Congress about more than 10 years ago, we were talking about reform. There was actually money in the trust fund. But largely that's been squandered by one Congress and one administration after another. It's long gone by the time we got to Washington in our administration. So right now there's no substitute for reforming it. But let me be real clear. You don't look old enough to be on Social Security, but I'll take your word for it. Okay, good. There's going to be automatic cuts in Social Security in 8 years if we don't reform it. Nobody is talking about that except maybe me. For the average family, that's $17,000 less income a year. And you say, well, why would they be automatic? Because the law requires it. The law essentially says if the funding is not there, then the automatic cuts have to happen. So to me, that's part of how you sell this overall reform, Tom, is you go to the American people and say, I don't want anybody who's senior to face cuts. We've got to reform the system. And I think the way you reform it is by putting it on a fiscally sound path in the long term. And that'll also create the kind of economic conditions that'll bring down inflation. I really believe it. It's a great question. Okay, yes, sir, right here.
Hi, my name is Paul Tarnowski. I'm from town here.
Hi,
And
Paul.
just want to thank you very much for making yourself available for this forum. My question is really surrounding the whole Israeli issue right now and the Abraham Accords, and I know there's been some talk of Iran and Saudi Arabia joining that, or there was, and I thought that there was some, with all the conflict in that Arab world, how is that going to, if they are able to join that, how would that impact things, do you think, at this point?
It's starting to feel like an opportunity lost. I mean, President Joe Biden wouldn't even use the word Abraham Accords for the first 2 years in office. I mean, we achieved the first peace deal in the Middle East in some 30 years with the Abraham Accords that were signed in the fall of 2020. Normalized relations with 2 Arab countries and Israel. And this administration came in and spent more time trying to appease Iran beg Iran to get back in the Iran nuclear deal than they did try to forge stronger ties. And other powers filled the vacuum. China negotiated a treaty between Iran and Saudi Arabia a year ago. Didn't get a lot of press, but it happened. I mean, nature abhors a vacuum. And President Joe Biden has created a vacuum of world leadership, of American leadership on the world stage. And we just got to be honest about it. But now with this unprovoked and horrific attack by Hamas on the people of Israel, it feels to me like real progress is going to have to take a second chair to Israel doing what it needs to do. And I believe Israel's our most cherished ally. I believe America should speak with one voice in this moment and make it clear to the world that we will stand with Israel today, we will stand with Israel tomorrow, we will stand with Israel through the hard fighting that has to happen to secure their nation in the days ahead. And I will. Because I know the day will come someday soon when many in the global media and the global debate will shift from remembering the horrors of this last weekend and begin to call for restraint by Israel. But I think this is a moment where we have to stand with Israel. I believe, last thought, I believe the progress we made with the Abraham Accords began with the fact that under our administration, America made it clear that we were standing with Israel every day. Moved the embassy, we recognized Golan Heights, recognized Jerusalem, embassy there, everything. All the things that we did made it clear that Israel and the security and safety and prosperity of the Jewish state of Israel was our top priority. And then that created the conditions for peace. I really do believe that in this moment we've got to see Israel through this extraordinary time, see them through to peace and security, and then on the basis of that firm stand with Israel, I think peace can become possible. But likely not with this administration that spent more time trying to appease the enemies of Israel in the region than to build new friends. Okay. How about, let me go back here. Let me see somebody. Nobody over here has got any questions. Yeah. Yes, sir. Son. Then you're next.
So my name's Colton. I'm a resident of Exeter, and I've heard a lot of talks about other countries, and not one growing in our country right now, mental health and the mental health crises that we go through every single day. You know, a lot of people in school are suffering from mental health, and I want to know like what your policies are on that, and what's your stance, because you know we grow day in and day out of kids getting shot up at schools because of a mental health crisis. I think they're very linked, and I think that
I do
you know,
too.
Yes, sir. And I think that, you know, a lot of the administrations right now and previous have not really, you know, took advantage of dealing with those things while they're happening. And then along with that, your opinion on guns and your policy on guns.
Yeah.
Because, you know, in New Hampshire, we don't really have, you know, too many issues. We do have a concealed carry, and no one has, you know, any big issues with that. But other states, there is. And in other states, they don't even want you to, you know, have a gun. So just wanted to hear what you had to say about that.
Wonderful. What's your first name? Colton?
Colton.
Colton. Good question. Well done. First, I believe as much in the Second Amendment as I do in the First Amendment. I'm a Constitution guy. And I believe in the right to keep and bear arms by law and abiding citizens is enshrined in the Constitution. And I'll always stand by it. But I want to agree with you very strongly on, I think mental health is the new pandemic in this country. It was probably exacerbated by the COVID pandemic, but it's an issue that I think we have to come to terms with as a country. In the wake of one of the recent mass shootings, I gave a speech in Indianapolis, which I called for a couple of measures, 4 in particular. You can look it up. But one of the centerpieces of my agenda for dealing with this raging violence that's impacting our communities is that I think we've got to have a national conversation about returning to institutional mental health care. I will tell you, this isn't a new idea for me, Colton. When I was governor of Indiana, in my last year, we broke ground on the first new mental health hospital to be built in the state of Indiana in 35 years. And the truth is, somewhere back in the 70s, there's a few of us in the room old enough to remember it. Back in the 70s, we, as a nation, walked away from institutional mental health care. We just did. And it grieves my heart to think how many people who are experiencing homelessness actually also have severe but benign mental health issues in their lives that are dealt with through medications that are passed out as opposed to actually having them have some place to go. But when you're dealing with the issue of violence, which you speak to, I thought very eloquently, young man, so well done. I'll just never get over the fact that during our administration, the Parkland shooting happened. And I remember seeing an interview with the mother of the shooter, who lamented how many times she had gone to the school and to local law enforcement asking for somewhere to send her son. And there was nowhere to go. I mean, when I talked to sheriffs back when I was governor of Indiana, they would tell me, we deal with this every day. Half of the people in our lockup on any given weekend are people that are dealing with mental illness. And they're able to hold them under the law. Shouldn't hold them any longer than the law allows, but 2 or 3 days, and then they let them go because there's nowhere else to go. And I think we ought to have a national conversation about returning to institutional mental health care and making it possible for families to have the ability to get a young person help when they're dealing with the beginnings of what could be serious mental illness. And I commend you for focusing on it. But it's something I'll lead on if I'm president. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, I'll bet.
My name's Leslie, and I'm from Exeter.
Hi, Leslie.
First, Vice President Pence, I'm here because I want to thank you for what you did on January 6th. You exhibited a lot of courage. It was an ugly, ugly day, and thank you for helping to sustain our democracy. Thank you. And I have a question.
Please.
Different topic, and I was here for another forum. I'm not hearing any of the Republicans talk about one of the big issues that's going on in our world, in our country, which are the raging storms, the rising sea level, climate change. So, will you talk a little bit about climate change and fossil fuels? Thank you.
Yeah, Leslie, number one, thank you for your gracious words. Look, the climate is changing. Certainly. Over the next 100 years, there'll be some projected changes in global climate. The question is, what do you do about it? The answer of those that advocate what's generally regarded as the Green New Deal is to heavy-handed government subsidies, government mandates. We're going to drive Americans into electric vehicles. We're going to raise the cost of energy generated from traditional sources of fossil fuels, and by raising the cost of that energy, and we're going to drive people into alternative sources of energy. The Paris Climate Accord was born of that idea as well, and the United States had committed itself to all these draconian measures to reduce CO2 emissions in our country, but the fatal flaw of that treaty was that it required virtually nothing of China, nothing of India for decades, while it required things of the United States today. Our administration got out of the Paris Climate Accord, but here's what you don't know, or maybe you do, because I can tell you're very with it. Yeah, she knows. So let's move on. No, we reduced CO2 emissions during our administration by more than the Paris Climate Accord required. But we did it through American innovation, through a natural gas boom, through essentially clean energy alternatives. We became a net exporter of energy for the first time in 75 years. And at the same time, we literally lowered CO2 emissions in the country. But to me, the antidote here is market forces, not mandates. I mean, I'm somebody that I believe one of the great traditions of the Republican Party is conservation. I used to have a portrait of Teddy Roosevelt in my office at the White House, who, you know, invented the national parks system and was a great conservationist. I just think the choice that we have is whether we're going to go with a command and control socialist model for making progress in the environment, or whether we're going to encourage and create a free market environment that will continue to move toward a cleaner and cleaner environment and address the long-term challenges that we face. I'm going to err on the side of the free market. Well, thank you. Well, I'm troubled about the subsidies of the Green New Deal for electric vehicles, most of which benefit battery makers in China at this point, truthfully. And frankly, I think part of the reason why the strike is happening in the automotive industry out of Detroit is because, and I know something about the automotive industry, is that the reason that happened was because people's wages weren't keeping up in this economy, and they're very concerned about the federal government and some state governments like California forcing American automakers into electric vehicles, shutting down plants in Michigan and having them open up in other states and in other countries around the world. So I believe in the free market, and I believe we can make progress, as we did, promoting free market innovation. Yes, sir. Hi.
Thanks for being here today, Vice President Pence.
Thank
My
you.
name's Dan. I live here in Exeter.
Hey, Dan.
I own a business right across the street. I want to ask you a question about gerrymandering. I believe that gerrymandering empowers autocrats on both sides of the political spectrum at the far ends. We're seeing a great example of that right now with 8 folks paralyzing our House of Representatives. Understanding that it's a state issue, what would you do as president to use your bully pulpit to lead us towards nonpartisan districting at both the state level and in the congressional level?
Well, the great long history of state legislatures being able to draw district lines. Now they have to reflect respect for civil rights. They can't be about disenfranchising certain Americans. The courts have been very firm on that issue. I expect they'll continue to be. But I actually, look, I've had some tough words for what I call the chaos caucus in my party on Capitol Hill. I mean, I was a leader in the Congress. I fought the big spenders in my own party a lot, including a Republican president who was spending too much money. You can ask them, they all remember, right? But it never would have occurred to me to partner with every Democrat on Capitol Hill to oust a Republican Speaker of the House. I mean, and I said today that it's time for the adults in the room on Capitol Hill to sit down with those 8 members and anybody else and tell them with everything that's happening in this economy, and American families are struggling, a crisis at our border, and the world now at war in 2 different theaters, they just got to come together. They got to elect a speaker, and they got to move forward. And I'm very firm on that. And ultimately, though, I believe voters will hold them accountable, individually and collectively, if they fail to do that. Now, that being said, I know that there's a temptation to think that particular districts that become monolithically one side or the other. To me, I just honestly believe that the elected representatives of the people of our states ought to be entrusted with the right court supervision about preserving and protecting the rights of citizens under our civil rights laws, to sort that out. I worry that if you go to a nonpartisan independent panel, as some states have done, that it would end up looking about as partisan as it does now. It would just be a different partisanship. So I honestly believe that the antidote here is more democracy, not less. Is for us to call on leaders today, and to have leadership at the top that will create an environment that doesn't reward just the loudest voices, but rewards people that are actually producing results. But I think I'll maybe leave it there. I think it starts at the top. You know, as I said earlier, I'm a conservative. I'm not in a bad mood about it. People that have served with me, Republicans and Democrats, know that I'm respectful of people, whether they disagree with me on issues or not. And I've actually had good relationships with people across the aisle over the years and still do. But I honestly think that part of the reason Joe Biden becomes president is because he promised that he was going to change the tone in Washington, D.C. He didn't. Almost immediately after he took office, we're having Republicans' election reforms called Jim Crow 2.2, accusing entire states of racism. And his consistent speech is about essentially trying to equate every Republican voter in the country with people that perpetrated violence on a tragic day. People are done with that. I think people want to see principled leadership back in the White House that sets a tone for how we can work together and rewards people that are producing for the country. And I promise you I will. Yes. Hi, right there. What's your name?
Hi, I'm Tara. I live in Brentwood. You mentioned earlier COVID impacted a lot of people, the mental health of our young people especially. Between school lockdowns, between vaccine mandates, those were things that directly impacted our young kids. The vaccine mandates almost prevented my daughter from going on to college. Mm-hmm. Instead, she got the COVID vaccine, ended up in ICU, and 2 years later, she is still in the process of recovering. And we know many people who have had severe reactions to the vaccine. My question to you is, what do you believe could be done differently to ensure that our kids and the young people don't have to go through lockdowns, don't have to experience mandates, don't have to go through these things if we have another public emergency?
Right. It seems to come around about every 100 years, but we'll have another one. And that's why I think we need to learn the lessons of this one. Give your daughter a hug for us, please, and wish her well. We'll say a prayer for her before we leave today. Number one, here, look, China, it's a couple of things that we need just to learn. Number one, that virus came from a Chinese lab, and China should be held accountable. I remember when I was leading the coronavirus task force, I was tapped to lead it about 2 months after it was set up. And the president had put a number of doctors on them, one of whom became very famous. And I'll just never forget how many times I would turn to Dr. Fauci and say, doesn't it make sense that it came from a lab in Wuhan? I said, absolutely not. It never came from a lab in Wuhan. But then the head of CDC, who was a wonderful man, and a virologist would sit at the end of the table in the Situation Room and say, it came from a lab. And I just think we just have to accept that, and we have to hold China accountable for it, for what they inflicted on the world and what they hid from the world once it was breaking out across their country. Number two, I'm proud of Operation Warp Speed. We generated a vaccine that I believe protected vulnerable lives, but vaccines should never, ever have been mandated, and they should never be mandated in that situation again, ever. I want to tell you, I'm still infuriated by the fact that while the Supreme Court threw out the vaccine mandate, while the Congress threw out, with Republican leadership, the mandate on vaccines for military members, we still require healthcare workers to get a vaccine. Now, I have to tell you, a lot of people like to pose and posture about what they did during COVID, elected officials. Who the heroes were doctors and nurses and people working at hospitals that never hesitated to go to work long before there was any protection, any vaccine of any kind. And I think it's unconscionable that people who showed up for work without any protection and never hesitated, were then told, you're going to lose your job if you don't take a vaccine. It's just simply wrong. It's wrong to do that. Last lesson I've learned and internalized is schools should have never been closed, ever. Now, what I would tell you is if we'd have gotten 4 more years, there'd have never been a vaccine mandate. And I'll tell you something that might also surprise you. We never suggested that schools be closed, ever. And so one of the things that I want to think about, there was a conversation about state and federal authorities. Look, I was a governor. I mean, when I was tapped to lead the task force, I put every governor in the country on a video screen in the Situation Room, and we started talking, because when it comes to a health crisis here in New Hampshire or elsewhere, it's governors that lead the way. They just do. I'd gone through a couple of those crises when I was governor, and CDC helps you, they advise you, but you do the work. Your public safety people do, your public health people do, that's how it works. But when I saw the way some governors took temporary measures that were designed just to make sure that our hospitals had the supplies and equipment they needed, and then imposed lockdowns, some Democrat mayors and Democrat governors imposed lockdowns and shut down schools for months on end. I think we need to think really hard about who sets that agenda in the future. Because the American people ought to have every right to know that when a national emergency has been declared, that the national leadership then sets the tone for national solutions. And that we're not going to have states that are putting even a greater hardship on families by imposing these draconian measures that we saw imposed on schools, that we saw imposed on businesses. And those are part of the lessons learned. But I want to tell you, I'll always be proud of what the American people did during the worst pandemic in 100 years. And someday that history will be written, not of the politicians and the stands they took or didn't take, but what everyday Americans did for vulnerable Americans to see us through that pandemic is something that will always inspire me.
Mr. Vice President, we have time for one last question if you want to make it a good one and then give some closing remarks.
Okay, super. Let's go. How about this young man? He dressed up so nicely to be here. I'm not running off, though. If you want to visit afterwards, I'd be delighted to shake every hand in the room. Sir.
Mr. Vice President, China has been a main topic of a lot of our questions here. Having lived in Asia for the first 10 years of my life, I wanted
Where'd you live?
Thailand.
Oh.
I want to know, as president, how would you address our bases, the issue of us pressuring China, having bases in Japan, and making deals over the past 2 administrations, having more bases in the northern island of the Philippines. I would like to know how you address that as President of the United States. Thank you.
Yeah. China is the greatest economic and strategic threat the United States of America faces in the 21st century. In fact, one of the reasons why I believe it's in our national interest to not only stand with Israel strongly, but to stand with the Ukrainian military to give them the means to make their fight is because China's watching. China's made no secret of the fact that they would like to grab Taiwan. Free and democratic country. Just as they did Hong Kong when they broke their agreement with the United Kingdom. Look, I think the way that we deal with China is not by diminishing our commitment to the Asia-Pacific, it's by increasing our commitment. I think we need to build a 355-ship Navy. I think we need to see to and ensure the freedom of navigation in the world, including in the South China Sea. I think we need to use access to our economy in the form of tariffs on Chinese goods coming in until China opens their economy to U.S. goods, what we make and what we grow. I mean, years of trade abuses, intellectual property theft have got to stop. We took a strong stand on China during our administration, but it needs to be stronger still. We also need to bring that pressure so that China stops their military provocations in the Asia-Pacific. Make it clear to them that we'll defend those military installations that were bought with the blood of American service members. 75 years ago, that will stand by our interest and our allies in the region. And we also want to stand strong to get China to end the human rights abuses against their own people, Muslim Uyghurs, Christian pastors that are in jails as we speak. Look, there ought to be a price to our relationship with China that says if you want normal trade relations with America, if you want normal economic exchange, then you have to join the family of nations, respect intellectual property and your military provocations, and end the human rights abuses in your country. So for me, it's all about standing firm and putting great hope in the people of China. I mean, China's run by the Chinese Communist Party today. But the truth is, the Chinese people are a good, decent, loving people that just like all people yearn for freedom. And I think to the extent that we stand firm, use the power of the greatest economy in the world, we strengthen the greatest military in the world, I believe we have an opportunity for a peaceful future with China and progress for the Chinese people. But we need to stand firm. Maureen?
Do you want to say some final remarks?
Well, I just want to say thank you all very much for coming. I look forward to shaking every hand in the room if you can stick around. Join me in thanking USA Today and Seacoast Group Media for putting this event together. I would tell you, if you'd like to know more about our work and our campaign, I'd love it if you went to MikePence2024.com, log on. If you want to send us $1, I'd be grateful for it. But you can read all the policies that we've been laying out. And I just want to tell all of you that I really do believe that the best days for this nation are yet to come. We just got to have government as good as our people. And I intend to go get it for us. So help me God. Thank you very much. God bless you.